Very much for being here tonight. I hope that you find the information that we've developed helpful and interesting. Just as a note, Colorado Mountain College provides this service in terms of survey work and some of those sort of things to any nonprofit or governmental entity in our service area. So our interest as a community college is making sure that our communities have good information upon which they can base decision making and policy and that sort of thing. So our interest here, when Leadville Trail 100 Legacy Foundation approached us, was to really take an unbiased look at what is the economic impact of this race series. As a note, I would just mention that we've got another project underway here in Leadville right now with the St. Vincent's Hospital, where we're looking at community perceptions. And so that's a report that you'll see come out. We're just getting ready to start distributing survey instruments now, so it'll probably be 3-4 months before we have something that's public at that point. So what we do is we develop the report. It's on file at the library up at the college, at the reference desk. And then the agency that we work with can take it and do whatever they want to do with it, for internal purposes or external or whatever that may be. So why don't we jump into the project here. When we were first approached to do an economic impact study, the first thing we had to do was sort of figure out how to do that. And so we worked with our institutional research folks at the district office, which is in Glenwood Springs, worked with them to develop the survey to figure out sort of what are the best practices for doing this. And then I was very fortunate. Tara Hosick from the Climax Mine has hired the Docking Institute at Fort Hays State University to do economic impact studies in the past. So when I called Michael Walker and dropped her name, he actually took the call and helped me out quite a lot. So he was a consultant throughout this process as well. And then we conducted a literature review to really look at several things and make sure that we really understood what some of the best practices were on that. So we found sample survey instruments, industry standards for economic multipliers, which we'll get into a little bit here in a minute, and then other impact studies that were conducted on similar events, races, or everything from NASCAR to bicycle races to marathons, just so we had a good sense of sort of how they structured their research and how they reported their data, that sort of thing. So that's sort of the grounding of how we did this. Next I'll have I should have introduced you. Jan Krueger is the Director of Operations here at CMC Leadville, and she really started the process with the survey part, so we'll let her talk about that.
So we started this process last summer when we understood that we were going to undertake this procedure. And so the first thing I did was go to a class that was being conducted at CMC last summer. Susanna Spalding was teaching an advanced computer applications for business. And together with those students, we researched similar surveys. We found a race in San Luis Obispo. I had never been involved in anything with the race series before, so I was learning from scratch everything about the race. I went downtown and spoke with employees at the race series, found out everything I could from their literature and from them. And so once we looked at this information that we gathered, we formulated questions that would be pertinent to the amount of money that the racers were spending for food, lodging, fuel, other expenses they may have in town. And then we added some questions that we thought might be pertinent, that would provide information that would be useful to the community at large, such as if the racers owned second homes in Leadville, and if they visited any place like museums or historical sites while they were here in town, as well as we asked how long they stayed in town and how many people they brought with them. After the survey was formulated, we sent it to the Institutional Research Department in Glenwood Springs at CMC to have them check it over and see if it looked okay. They found a couple things that could be worded better, so we made those changes in the formatting and in the questions. And then I emailed the survey to Josh, the representative of the race series. He emailed it out to the 4,000 racers. And he added an incentive of a chance to win a race series shirt that was specialized and that we thought might increase the chances of the racers responding. The survey that was emailed gave a link to a website that the Institutional Research Department uses to accumulate the results. So some time passed, a few weeks passed, a sufficient number of responses were received, and the department tabulated the responses, emailed the results to us, and then from our research on how to interpret the data, and after reaching out to the experts that Mike mentioned, we were able to prepare the report. So Mike will review the details of the report.
So just to clarify, 4,000 racers in 2012, that's the entire population. That's everybody that participated in that year. So a 20.32% response rate when you're dealing with a population instead of a sample response rate is certainly something you can generalize back to the population. That's 813 surveys, completed surveys that we received. And then if you look at margin of error at 95%, we're estimating, or what the statistics tell us is that that's plus or minus 3% from a margin of error standpoint. So pretty good. We're pretty happy with the response rate. We feel like this is a good representation of the races, or the race participants, and we can generalize to the population. I thought it was just interesting as well that this is these are the events that the respondents indicated that they had participated in. And so as you can see, the mountain bike is the biggest participation level. The trail run, 100 run, is the next biggest, although the trail marathon and heavy half run. And as a non-runner, I have no idea what that means, but I assume it's a long ways. That was actually the second largest event that people participated in. So when you're looking at economic impact, you really want to look at three things. One is direct economic impact. Racers who come here and spend money on lodging, food, whatever it is that they're spending money. Obviously that's an economic impact, but that's really only part of the story. When you talk about indirect impact, what you're really dealing with there is, and I'll use Safeway for an example if Craig's okay with that. Craig says, oh my gosh, there's going to be 1,000 racers in town. I'm going to buy extra groceries to ensure that those racers have, that there's enough product here for them to buy. Well, that's an indirect impact. Now, when you're dealing with a large city, or a country that's hosting the Olympics, for example, they can pretty much capture all of the indirect impact because the wholesalers and the manufacturers are in the same political entity that is hosting the event. When you're dealing with a rural community, however, almost all of the indirect impact leaks out of the community. So when Craig buys extra supplies, that money's going to Safeway corporate, or whoever their wholesalers are, who are not probably located in Leadville. And then the second thing is, the third factor that you look at are induced activity or effects. And those are, I'm going to pick on you tonight, I hope that's okay. Craig says to one of his employees, I'm going to give you some overtime because we want to open a little earlier and stay open a little later. That person takes that overtime and spends it, the pay that they received because of that. That's induced activity. In other words, they wouldn't be doing that unless the race series was giving them extra hours and inducing that spending. Almost all of that is captured. About 80% of that is captured within the community, and so you're able to count that as well. So given that, depending on the size of the entity, when you look at a multiplier in a larger municipality or a state level, you might use a multiplier of 4 or 5 on your direct impact to figure out what your indirect and induced impact was. Because we're a rural community and most of that indirect is going to leak out, we used a multiplier of 1.92. When you get the report, and we'll distribute that this evening, you'll be able to see the references, and we have that from several academic sources and then one industry source that says this is in the ballpark. That's the multiplier that you really ought to rely on. And then, as I mentioned, that economic leakage if we don't do policy recommendations coming out of this type of research, but one thing you might consider as community leaders is, are there ways that we can stop some of that leakage? Are there ways that we can encourage wholesalers, encourage businesses to buy products within town and then resale them, because that would keep more of the economic impact in Lake County. As you can see here, for food and beverage, it was $1.8 million, a little over that. Lodging at $3 million, transportation at $753,000, and other at $1.6 million to round it up. So on average, they spent about $1,795. They spent 6.77 days in town, and they brought 3.65 people with them. And as we extend that out then, as we apply the multiplier for the indirect and direct, what we see is that the direct impact is $7.8 million, the indirect is $1.5 million, and then the induced is $5.6 million, for a total economic impact just in 2012 of $15 million. The next thing I want to touch on are some economic factors that aren't included in direct, indirect, or induced, but are certainly relevant to the community. So we asked them, how many of you have returned to Lake County since you participated in the race for any reason, vacation, training, anything like that? 60% indicated that they had returned to the community since their first race. We asked them, how many of you have visited museums or historical sites? 54% indicated that during their stay, during the race, they had also visited one of those sites. And then we asked them, well, how many of you have purchased a second home? And normally, you could look at that as a direct impact, but because it was 4%, we didn't feel as comfortable with that, but we did do some analysis on just those 4%. So just the people who said, yep, I had bought a second home, we took a look at, well, what sort of activity did that stimulate, just that activity? So when you look at realtor fees, taxes, and then the actual real estate transaction itself, it's not included anywhere else. We worked with Howard Tritz, the assessor, to get information about average cost of developed property in Leadville. And then we also worked with him on the tax, the various tax entities, the taxing districts, and so what someone might pay on that average property. And I think it's important to note that he worked, it took him actually some time to figure out right down the middle. So we weren't inflating this by saying, well, they must be buying fancier houses. It's the average home in Leadville. Those transactions totaled $5,746,000 with $42,000 in ongoing tax benefit. As long as they own that home, they're going to be paying that tax. So we thought that was a pretty important and interesting factor as well. But it's important to note that we wouldn't generalize that to the 4,000, or certainly to all racers. We think that there is likely that more of the second home buyers reported, or that at least was possible, so we chose not to include it in the direct impacts. As I mentioned, the full report's available at CMC at the reference library, basically forever. You're welcome to come and get it. We do have copies here tonight. And other than that, we just opened up for questions.